government is now putting India in a key position in its regional architecture and its understanding of the region. Now, what worries security analysts and strategists about this whole Indo-Pacific is that the security challenges here are legion, and they cover every single scale, from irregular piracy, terrorism, all the way up through the potential of interstate conflict. And if you think, it would be brilliant if we had a map, but if you can kind of think about the region, a map of the region, a large portion of this Indo-Pacific encompasses what we might call the arc of instability that stretches from Southeast Asia up through Central Asia, the Middle East, and then down to East Africa. Not only can a large portion of the world's failed and failing states be found here, you have a number of countries that have maritime or territorial disputes with their neighbors, and of course, the scourges of piracy and terrorism. Now, all of these challenges are real, but what I've been asked to focus on today is the challenge to the existing regional order. So what do we mean by order? What I'm talking about is the rules and norms that govern state interactions, which we situate at the post-war conferences that took place after the end of the Second World War that gave rise to institutions like the United Nations, like the World Bank, and in later periods, the WTO and the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. And the principal challenges to this existing regional order, in my view, come from two states. They come from China, and they come from the United States. They come from China in the sense that China, while not explicitly rejecting the idea of a rules-based order, does, when necessary, try to twist and challenge interpretations of these rules that don't accord with its own national interests, and of course, at times, will attempt to reject them outright. They come from the United States because we are seeing, particularly under the Trump administration, increasing uncertainty about the willingness of Washington to uphold and backstop these rules that, of course, the United States had a principal role in helping to craft so many decades ago. And so I want to say a bit more about each of these two countries. So China's various maritime and territorial disputes with its neighbors are largely rooted in historical and nationalist narratives that are not necessarily bolstered by contemporary international law. So we see events like when the Permanent Court of Arbitration rules against Beijing, as they did on the South China Sea in the Philippines case, that the legitimacy of this body, the jurisdiction of this body is challenged, and of course robust efforts are taken to create new facts on the ground, such as building artificial islands, which are then subsequently militarized. Beijing has subsequently challenged other states' interpretations of what it means to have freedom of navigation or freedom of overflight, and as we've already heard, this is combined with a very deft use of economic diplomacy that's already sort of divided and neutralized bodies like ASEAN as being meaningful regional actors. The so-called debt trap diplomacy of the Belt and Road Initiative has already provided entrees and access in the Indian Ocean in places like Sri Lanka and the Maldives, and Pakistan, providing sort of access points in a naval sphere that, of course, is accompanied by increased naval presence by the PLA Navy. Now, collectively, the leading countries of the Indian Ocean or Indo-Pacific region that prefer the existing open order to some sort of Chinese-led alternative, and I'm talking about countries here that have already been mentioned, Japan, Australia, India, and the US, possess on paper the economic and military capabilities to backstop the present order. The question that really arises is whether any have the will to do so. And this is where the United States is increasingly a problem, because the Trump administration seems to be taking steps that actively undermine the existing regional order. So withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade negotiations, an increase in economic protectionism, basically undermines the ability to forge or to articulate a regional economic order that would allow countries in the Indo-Pacific to achieve their development goals without having to take Chinese investment money. Moreover, allies and partners of the United States in Asia, in Europe, and other parts of the world are increasingly uncertain about Washington's ability and willingness to uphold its existing commitments, and particularly given the current administration's willingness to impose tariffs on treaty allies, despite the national security implications, there are real concerns about where the United States is going. So insofar as continued engagement by the United States in the Indo-Pacific is critical to maintaining the existing order, interested countries do need to expend diplomatic capital trying to persuade those in Washington who will listen that the U.S. needs to remain committed to shaping and upholding the authority of regional rules. But at the same time, it will be necessary for countries to act on their own, to sort of take the leadership mantle that hopefully, just for the time being, the U.S. has abdicated, which means speaking out and speaking up when specific rules are being challenged, even if there are potentially consequences for doing so. Now, fortunately, I will say there are positive signs that this is happening. So we have the continuation of the successor to the TPP trade negotiations are still happening. The recently concluded Japan-EU trade pact, a free trade agreement, is also a very positive sign. In the security realm, we do have India, Japan, Australia with their own separate trilateral consultations. The UK and France have at least symbolically begun to push out the European role in this region, whether it's undertaking freedom of navigation operations, though we're not calling them that, in the South China Sea. The recent agreement between France and India on joint base access is a very positive development. So we can see, with Anglo-French defense cooperation expected to survive Brexit, there are opportunities for, say, France, UK, India cooperation and partnership in, say, the Western Indian Ocean region, which is a section of the world the United States gives less attention to. Now, even with American involvement, but particularly without it, various economic and strategic initiatives to bolster the existing regional order, should we wish to do so in the Indo-Pacific, do need to be tightly coordinated amongst interested parties and move from sort of an ad hoc individual basis to something that's much more institutionalized and expands beyond these principal Quad countries that were mentioned to engage Vietnam, to engage South Korea at times, and to engage Indonesia. So I don't think we have to be unduly pessimistic that Beijing's vision of the future will automatically triumph in the Indo-Pacific. We need to recognize that the present system or the present order can only be sustained by taking the challenges that it faces seriously and collectively mobilizing to address them.
Okay, thank you then. That overview of the rules-based order and the challenges to it they're involved in the region. Okay, so we have around, I guess, 10 minutes or so for questions and answers and discussion. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and please let me know your affiliation. Yes, Jonathan.
Jonathan Isle from Russi. One question, a sort of two-headed question on the subject of the potential difficulties and obstacles. First, to my colleague, on defense cooperation, the DRDO, which you mentioned, the sort of obsession of DRDO, which sort of monopolizing research, and the way that it stifles private initiative inside India as a sort of monster, state-owned monster that seems to want to do everything. Do you think there is an understanding of the government about the need to restrict the scope of DRDO in order to allow a much bigger private enterprise tie-ups with defense manufacturers? And the broader question to all of you, I think, on China. Do you think we can have a meaningful long-term partnership on security questions with India without India itself deciding how it views China?
Okay, thank you. Maybe we should take two questions at a time. Would anyone else would like to? Yes, the gentleman at the back, please.
Commodore Saxena, the Naval Advisor at the Indian High Commission. Thank you all for your comments. Very quickly, some counter-narratives, if I may. Aditya, your point about the armed forces wanting to model themselves from the British Armed Forces, I'll just say that since 1947, when we were identically modeled and everything that we knew about ourselves as a Navy, we learned from the Royal Navy. In every year since, the Royal Navy has decreased in size while the Indian Navy has increased. So, it's difficult now to model yourself to the same Navy because the Royal Navy doesn't do the kind of things that navies do. And therefore, I think the collaboration with industry particularly with private industry, I think it would go a long way further. About intellectual property rights, I think that criticism is a little harsh because there's been no instance of weapon proliferation in India, no AQ Khan sort of, idea to sell to Vietnam, unfortunately. But Humphrey, I would say that your contention that Russia is the only reliable arms supplier is, I think, a little dated idea, because if you see the P8s that have come from US or what we get from Israel or France, I don't think that's true. Russia will certainly give India stuff that nobody else will give. And that's why India has to go back to Russia, for instance, technology on nuclear submarines, which this country will not share because of the connect with the US and so on and so forth. My question to the panel is that, comparisons with Konkan and Malabar, if I may, the UK has returned now east of Suez and has fantastic bilateral relations both with Qatar and at the same time with Saudi Arabia, separately with Oman. And I was wondering if the UK would be up to a more multilateral approach outside the US-led CMF and include other regional players. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for those. If I hand over to Aditya.
Sure. On the DRDO question, yeah, this has historically been something that has been, concern even within private sector, within India as well. But I think the current administration does seem inclined to make things slightly smoother. And I would maybe perhaps argue that the appointment of the defense secretary, who has been vocally, encouraging of bringing outside investment into the defense sector, as the chairman of the DRDO, might perhaps help things in that sense. On the modeling, I mean, admittedly, it was a second-hand account, but essentially the point was just about the military cultures being from a common base, not necessarily on anything operational modeling or anything of that sort. On the intellectual property rights, this is more than just, the defense sector. It's a broader argument that broader, criticism within India of intellectual property rights protection. And just the massive legal infrastructure within India for IPR rights is indicative of that there is actually a problem. It's not specific to the defense sector, but it does tend to deter or discourage technology transfer. I'll let them. Yeah.
Yes, you're probably right about the Russian arms, but I think you still need the Russian bits, let's put it that way. I just want to make a broader point that sort of answers is that if China wants to prevail in the Indo-Pacific, which it does it wants 2049 as its lock-off date of the anniversary, and it wants to be India and Japan must feel safe. And its long-term policy now is to make those two countries feel safer with them than they are with the United States. Its test area has been Southeast Asia. And 5 years ago, many Southeast Asian countries, including the Philippines that took the Court of Arbitration, and Vietnam that had its thing, was sort of looking to the US to cover their backs whilst they went into the front line. But now if you talk to those same people, a good leader there is actually drawing up its plan B to see, okay, supposing it doesn't work, supposing we don't know what's going to happen in any presidential election. And there's one element that I'm not sure it's all of it there, and that is that by withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, what we've seen there is a détente between China and Japan. Now, it might not have just been that, but that could have been a catalyst to say, well, look, why don't we see if we can sort this out ourselves? And there were some very good CSIS satellite pictures of the fishing boats that used to go up to the disputed Senkaku Islands a couple of years ago, that they were all sort of crowding in on them, and radars were locking on this, and all sorts of things were happening. In the satellite pictures most recently, there's none of that's going on now. So all that dreadful stuff between Japan and China that you saw in 2012 go on is sort of easing off. And there's a maturity in the region that if China wants the US out of the region must feel safe with China.
So I'll take up Jonathan's question briefly. I mean, ultimately, India has China as a geographic neighbor. So it's an incredibly complicated relationship. I mean, I think that to be a partner with India accepts the fact that they have to find some way to live with China on its border. They can push back in certain areas, they can disagree in certain areas, and there are areas of commonality in terms of foreign policy goals and objectives in a macro sense. So a desire to see a more multipolar world, a desire for them to have better, a stronger voice, both countries in international affairs. There's the Pakistan factor, there is the trade imbalance factor, there's the growing encroachment, some would say, into what India has always seen as a sphere of influence. So I don't know if we'll ever get to a settled view of China within India, though I think we're seeing one that is far more skeptical, and even the overhyped reset that occurred a few months ago was really more of a revision to a mean after Doklam than something that's really moving the relationship in a new direction. But we could talk, I mean, this could be a topic for an entire conference in of itself. To take the Commodores, I don't know if the UK would be willing to do this, but I really hope they will. I've been pushing where I can for the UK to think really seriously about engaging India in the Persian Gulf and Western Indian Ocean. There's a lot of commonalities. There's a lot of relationships that the UK has to bring to the table that I think would help advance both countries' interests. So I really hope this is something that people take more seriously, but I can't really speak authoritatively on that subject.
Okay, thank you, Walter. I think we can take just one more question because I think we're running out of time. The person right at the back. Sorry, I can see a hand. Yes.
My question to the panel will be, we haven't heard really about the Chabahar port in Iran and the India-US recent relation and with the imposing, sanctions. So what role would you think Britain can play in the, sphere of influence which you were talking about? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to?
Sure. Well, unfortunately, Iran is a key cleavage in the Indo-US relationship. Maybe not as anywhere near as polarizing as Pakistan, but it is a real problem that this had sort of been isolated for a while, taken off the table by the nuclear agreement, and the Trump administration has put it back. I think it's just something where the two sides are going to have to be mature enough to sort of look past it, and if there is a goal to forge a long-term relationship, you may have to deal with some hiccups and bumps along the way and take a longer view of things. But it will be, it's going to be an irritant as long as the Iran issue remains salient within the United States.
I'd just like to add to that. The Iran issue is an example of what many people in Asia say, the unpredictability of democratic politics. So you've now got a situation where you have European companies being faced penalization for trade deals that they set up over the past 3 years, and they have to rearrange that whole thing. So getting back to the point about Russia and the weapons, you want to stick with what you know is going to last for several decades if you're doing research and development that go into that. And there's a prevailing view in Asia that's coming up, and it's not homogenous by any means, that in Britain and in the US, you don't have that reliability. So you might get the latest jet plane in, but you might not be able to get the spares if something turns around in the next 2 years after that.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're out of time for further questions, but maybe as chair I might just take a few moments. The question or the topic has been on Britain and India in the Indo-Pacific, and I think it's increasingly clear that India is located in the Indo-Pacific in a way that the UK isn't, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the UK shouldn't or cannot play a role in the region, particularly given its interests and its friendships with India and other countries. So insofar as the UK is increasingly a country that has interests in the region, perhaps we should extend the context a little bit and think more of an Atlantic Pacific in Britain's context and an Indo-Pacific in India's. And hopefully we will be able to work together to make the world and the region a more secure and stable place in the future. So I thank the panelists for their interventions, and I hope that this has added some light to this interesting subject, which I'm sure we're going to continue to extend and think about more in the future. Thank you.
Just a few changes from your program. I will be chairing this third session. on trade. And it actually, to be honest, the order of today's events has worked out quite well, because we've gone from kind of values and the foundation of the bilateral relationship. We've gone to the geostrategic interests, maybe common, some dividing. And going into trade, you know, in many ways, for British foreign policy adherents, people who follow British foreign policy, you know, wherever the trade goes, the British go. And, you know, it's just the way to get the attention of Whitehall, the way to get the attention. And not only that, you know, global trade is certainly going to the region. I have a few, you know, figures in front of me that kind of indicates, you know, some of these things. So we have the Asia Development Bank saying that by 2050, more than 50% of the world's GDP will be centered in the Asia region. We know that the middle classes, the global middle classes, will grow by 50%, and most of that in Asia, which means we're going to have like a kind of explosion of cities, an explosion of urban. I mean, we've seen that already to some extent in China, but that's going to happen all throughout the Indo-Pacific region. You know, infrastructure was mentioned in the very first panel. It was also mentioned a little bit in the second panel in terms of the kind of geostrategic elements and how infrastructure is viewed in things. So, you know, there's quite, you know, various interesting things that are happening within infrastructure that are not traditional. Joining me and taking Catherine McBride's place is Julian Jessup, forgive me, an economist who comes from the same institute. He stepped into the breach at the very last minute, almost risking seeing the England game tonight, but he has allowed himself to we've just got him in for this panel, and then he's out the door. We're very pleased to have you, sir. He will be bringing back in some of the elements to how Brexit, you know, and any sort of agreement will affect global Britain's ability to kind of really develop these types of trade, investment, and infrastructure projects with India in the future going forward. And then on my left-hand side is Duncan Bartlett, editor of Asian Affairs, also a former journalist, business journalist, with some background in reporting on finance. Also, like myself, comes with a keen eye on Japan as well as India. And so we will start with first, who would like to go first, actually? I'm kind of, yes? Okay, so Julian, I will start with you, and then Duncan will go over to you, and then we'll throw open for conversation, for discussion.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I thought I'd start with a few... Sorry. Right, thank you. Good afternoon, that's much better. Thought I'd start with a few general remarks on the political as well as the economic background to Brexit, because I think that's clearly very important in terms of how Brexit is going to shape UK external policy, including policy towards trade with countries like India. And in that respect, I found it's one of my favourite quotes from a UK politician in the run-up to Brexit. It's actually from Tony Blair. So not normally somebody that I agree with, and I don't think he expected me to agree with him in this case. What he has said here is that for the first time since its inception, a nation will have disrupted the onward march of European cohesion, left the European Union, and will have done so for reasons apparently at odds with the whole rationale for the Union's existence. And what I think is interesting about that quote is, although he's clearly coming from the Remain camp, I think with a few minor cheeky editing changes, that actually makes the case for leave pretty well. So he's talking about disrupting the onward march of European cohesion. If I just change that word to cohesion to integration or dominance, then you start to get a flavour of what Leave voters were thinking. And he says at the end, reasons at principle at odds with the whole rationale for the Union's existence. And if you believe, as clearly quite a few Brits did, that the reason for the Union's existence was to create some sort of federal superstate that overrides British sovereignty in a number of areas, then maybe he's actually making quite a good case for Brexit. Certainly, if you look at the political imperative for Brexit, I think it's well summed up by that phrase that you may have seen on the back of the bus. I'll ignore the one on the side of the bus about 350 million for the NHS. That was clearly nonsense. But on the back of the bus, it was saying, take back control. And I think that's a very key message that the government appears to be taking on board, the idea of taking back control of borders. So obviously that's about migration, taking back control of our laws, so repatriating powers to the Parliament in Westminster, taking back control of our money, so that's the 10 billion or so every year that the UK transfers to the EU. And if I think they'd really thought about it and could capture the public's imagination, I think they would also have said taking back control of trade policy. Now, how do you deliver those aims? Well, I think if you look at those aims, it's pretty clear that you have to leave both the European Union's single market and customs union. If you remain within the single market, you have to accept the free movement of people from the rest of Europe, which I think is a red line. You also have to accept a lot of EU regulation, again, which is imposed by the EU and regulated by EU courts. So I think you have to leave the single market. I also think, though, you have to leave the customs union. I mean, remaining within a customs union is clearly convenient. It minimises border checks. It obviously keeps zero tariff trade within the EU. But it does require you to operate the same trade policy with regard to the rest of the world as the EU does. So it doesn't give you independence on trade policy. And frankly, if we were sitting here today talking about a future where the UK was going to remain both in the single market and the customs union, then a lot of the discussion about opening up the UK economy to the rest of the world becomes a lot less interesting, because we'll be having that conversation in Brussels, not here in London. But provided we are leaving both the single market and the customs union, and we'll find out more details about that from the white paper next week, then I think potentially this does open up huge opportunities. The priority for the government at the moment is to minimise the costs, to make sure we have as close as possible a relationship with the EU as we do now. After all, the EU is, and for some time will remain, our biggest single trading partner. So the focus now is on minimising those costs by getting a comprehensive free trade deal and by having as streamlined as possible customs arrangements after Brexit. But once that piece of the jigsaw is in place, we can start looking outwards and being much bolder in our trade agreements with the rest of the world. Now, there's a whole range of different options here. I mean, I personally, being an economist, would rather we just simply go down the route of unilateral free trade. I think we should simply just start to lower our trade barriers, both tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, straight away. Our consumers would clearly benefit, and I think in time other countries would see the benefit as well of that and would follow. More realistically, though, we might be looking at a series of new bilateral arrangements. I mean, hopefully the US will be near the front of the queue, but our Commonwealth partners, of course I'll include India in that, but also Australia, New Zealand. Perhaps also the UK could quickly seek to join other multilateral arrangements that are now coming back for the dead, like the TPP. I would very much hope that is the direction that the government takes, but I don't think it's guaranteed that's going to happen. I still think there are very strong protectionist and regulatory biases within the UK society. For example, as much as we might talk about the benefits of free trade in principle, when you talk about specific examples, people start to panic. They say that free trade would wipe out British manufacturing, or it would wipe out British agriculture. I think all you need to do, of course, is point to counterexamples like Singapore and Hong Kong in manufacturing, or New Zealand in agriculture, to show the benefits of free trade, but there's still quite a substantial barrier to overcome there. And when you talk about regulation, again, people raise lots of concerns about us being all forced individually to eat chlorinated chicken for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, even though that's not really on the menu. Even when talking about friendly countries like India, people raise concerns. I don't need to labour these here, but the two specific concerns one probably hears most often. One is about having a similar regime towards data protection. And the other is the absolutely ridiculous concerns that some in the British public have about migration, about family visas, about student visas and so on, which I'm sure quite rightly India would want more access to as part of a trade deal. So even though I think most people in British public life in principle are in favour of free trade and deregulation, in practice you have to fight hard, and one of the challenges at the IEA is always to come up with specific examples of how we'd actually be better off as a result of fewer trade barriers and more migration even than we have now. That's sort of the overall background. I'd be happy to comment further. Maybe the Speaker would like a thought.
Thank you very much, Julian. Thank you. Duncan, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Last night, as I was walking home from shopping in London, I dropped a £10 note out of my pocket. Actually, it slipped out of my pocket, because if you've got a £10 note in your pocket, you might have noticed that they're now made out of plastic, which makes them rather easy to slip out of your pocket. Amazingly, somebody picked it up off the pavement, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You've dropped a £10 note, sir." He said in a polite Australian accent, I think he was a visitor to the United Kingdom, "Thank you very much for returning my money to me." Having said that, I don't really like those slippery £10 notes. I think they're a bit ugly, and I wouldn't be too sad if we got rid of them soon. But, you know, our tenors are reasonably clean and intact, at least most of the time. That can't be said for the slimy, crumpled banknotes which one receives when one is in India. I'm sorry, but if it had been £10 worth of Indian rupees that I've dropped on the floor in a dirty puddle, I'm not sure that I would have been all that pleased if someone picked it up and returned it to my pocket. So for that reason alone, I was rather pleased when the Indian government introduced a policy of demonetisation in November 2016. Now, there are mixed reports on how effective that demonetisation policy has been in achieving its main goal, which was stamping out corruption. And I expect there were very many people who managed to find ways around the system and prevented being caught, such as by bribing other people to open bank accounts for them or selling rupee notes at a discount. And I expect this is one of those issues where local gossip and stories probably has as much impact on people's opinions about the issue than the careful appraisal of economists. But I think it's given a strong signal that the government of India is keen at least to try to combat corruption. And from what I've read in articles in The Economist and the Financial Times, there's quite a lot of evidence to show that it achieved one important goal, which is that it brought more people out of what's euphemistically known as the informal economy to become proper taxpayers. And the long-term benefit economically of having more people paying tax is very profound. It is the step by which countries move up from lower income to middle income. Now, looking at India from an international perspective, it always seems to me rather amazing that any political ideas make it through to become laws which are then enacted. It is a large and complex country with conflicting political and ideological ideas. So any policy at all which have a significant impact on the lives of the majority of citizens, I think can be regarded as a success, even if it's a qualified success, as is the case with demonetarisation. And yet, I've been making a list of some of the achievements which I think we've seen in the past few years under the Modi government. Has any country in the world attempted such a large-scale reform programme and such sweeping, wide-impact legislation across a very complex system? Under Modi, you've seen not only the improvements in terms of e-commerce, which means that more money is transferred by mobile phones than in cash, we've also seen safer trains, thanks partly to international investment and trade. More reliable insurance as a result of greater international competition, much less government paperwork. A lot of government services are now available online. Modern payment systems, and all of this has taken place in a country which has remained politically stable and largely peaceful. The challenge, I think, for India is persuading people to be patient. Because a lot of populist politicians in India, as elsewhere in Asia and in other parts of the world, will be running around telling voters that the system has failed them, that the big men in the capital don't care, that nothing's changing. It's time to throw them out of office and start again. And there is a very important debate to be had about income inequality in India. At the moment, India's per capita income is something like $1,700, much less than China's per capita income of $8,000. From a British perspective, I'm not saying I don't want to be paid any more Indian money, but I'd be happy if it's directly put into my bank account from now on. From an international perspective, India has achieved the fastest growing economy in the world. I think there are plenty of reasons to expect further acceleration in growth. The question India now faces is how will that prosperity be distributed across the citizenship?
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I think Chairman's prerogative, I might, you know, throw a question that links a little bit to the last panel, which, and also had its origins in a discussion in the first panel in which infrastructure was brought up. And infrastructure both would be, you know, something that has been contributed to. It was mentioned in the first panel as something that Japan has brought to the table in its relationship with India. And it was also mentioned in the security element as this kind of Belt and Road Initiative and Maritime Silk Road, this kind of new, you know, how geopolitical leveraging for power by using these big projects. Julian, this may be unfair to you, but is it something the UK can, I mean, I know Catherine McBride had brought,
Yeah.
she has the person you're replacing, but can you tell us, you know, how well equipped is the city as a financial district, and how well is the UK corporate world equipped for, shall we say, this infrastructure race?
Okay, well, I think that there are clearly areas where the UK has an advantage, but others where I think it's more on a level playing field. So if we think about areas where the UK has an advantage, I think the city is obviously it. I mean, despite the concerns about the impact of Brexit on the city, it's actually consolidated its position as the world's #1 financial centre since the vote to leave. And that's for reasons that are largely Brexit-proof. I mean, we all know the strengths of London as a place to do business and to live and to work. But also its sheer size, the critical mass, will make it very hard for other financial centres in Europe to compete even after Brexit. And the UK has always had a very open stance towards people raising money in London for foreign projects. So obviously we've got renminbi bonds and the equivalent for India. So I think the financial sector of the UK is always going to remain an important contributor to the infrastructure development of India. In terms of other areas, I think there's a danger of sort of being patronising. I mean, tempted to say things like, oh, British engineers can come and help you. Well, in fact, of course, Britain's crying out for engineers from India to come over and help us. I might talk about how good we are at managing big infrastructure projects, and then you can all stick your hands up and point to multiple failures in British infrastructure projects, particularly those run by the British government over the last few years. So I'm sure there are areas there that we can help in, but I suspect that we probably have at least as much to learn from you as you might ever learn from us. The city, though, is clearly a comparative advantage that we have, and I very hope that the city will clearly remain open for business for Indian banks and companies that want to raise money in global financial markets.
Duncan, do you want to have a stab at that, or any aspects of how UK can help India?
Well, when it comes to deciding how much international trade and business India wants, that's a decision for Indian policymakers, and it's been a subject of very considerable debate. Now, we've recently seen the arrival of Amazon and Walmart into the Indian e-commerce market, but not surprisingly, people say, what happens if they team up together and start distributing groceries? What will be the impact on the spice merchants in Chennai if they do that? So the whole debate about relaxing foreign direct investment has been something which has been, very politically charged within India. It has meant, I think, that there's been investment in some areas of infrastructure, particularly into the railways, which is a government priority. And I think that foreign direct investment in terms of distributing Indian-produced food and goods has been reduced almost to nothing. I mentioned cheaper and more efficient insurance as well. That's another area where there's been a progress as a result of international investment. A lot of big British companies are there already, Vodafone, BP, HSBC. But there is a danger, of course, that when you invite foreigners in, especially those big players like Amazon and Walmart, that you damage the development of local and national industries. And so I think that if you go back to India before the big reforms of the 1990s, there was a great deal of protectionism. When Prime Minister Modi addressed the Davos conference at the beginning of this year, he warned against protectionism. But there's still going to be a balance to be struck between encouraging international trade and investment, if they go exactly together, and risking the livelihoods of people who don't have as enormous resources as these big international companies.
So can I just come in
Yeah,
just
please
on
go
that? I mean, there's sort of indirect way I think the UK can help, which is as an example. I mean, by and large, the UK has been very welcoming to inward investment from the rest of the world. And by and large, it's one of the most lightly regulated economies in Europe. That does require some adjustments, some painful adjustments from time to time. But we do, for example, have one of the lowest rates of unemployment in Europe. It is important, as the other speaker was saying, to make sure that inequality is minimised, but you can do that through the tax and benefit system. What free markets tend to do is to make sure that the share of the cake itself is as big as possible, and then the government's role might be to make sure that's shared fairly evenly. But I think the UK does show, is sort of a shining example, I would say, of the benefits of being as open as possible, while making sure that you have a safety net there to make sure that there aren't significant numbers of people left behind through no fault of their own.
I think there must be a question in there on Make in India and the America First and Made in China 2025, but I'm not going to ask that question. Let's open it up to the audience. Again, if you can just wait for the microphone, keep your remarks maybe to 1 to 3 minutes, and tell us who you are.
Hi, Phoebe from Civiline. I was just wondering if I could expand on what you just spoke on there briefly. Do you think that there might be a hiatus between what the government in India is trying to do in terms of their initiatives to encourage foreign direct investment, and then actually what the Indian local population will do to respond to that? And that being the case, do you think that there will be an increase in backlash within India towards foreign investment, which causes monopolies on local investment opportunities?
Did you have a person to which you... No. Okay, so either one wants to take a stab at it.
Thank you for that question. So earlier on, somebody was complaining about the British tabloid press only running negative stories about India. The Indian media is absolutely fierce in its criticism of every possible policy initiative, isn't it? And that's true at a local level, and then every change in policy is hotly debated at a local level and how it's going to be implemented. So I think there is a backlash and there is a concern when people think that their jobs are being threatened by foreign competition. In a globalized economy, of course, that brings benefits as well as problems, and that's particularly true in India. Would there be a backlash? Well, I think what we're going to have to see in the run-up to the election which takes place in India next year is to what extent there's going to be people who say to themselves, well, you know, under the old socialist approach, we put the idea of wealth equal distribution as our priority. We tried to protect jobs. You know, if people had more than 100 people in a factory, it was very difficult to fire them and so on. Those policies at least prevented a lot of people from being left out of work and destitute. Perhaps we need to go back to more of that kind of approach. And you will certainly see, I think, that coming from the Congress Party, and probably taking more of a left-wing approach in perhaps alliances with left-wing political parties. So I think it will be a very hot political issue, actually. The economy is almost certain to be the central issue in terms of that election, the domestic political situation. To what extent people will feel that trade and investment is part of that, I think will depend on, you know, whereabouts they sit in the hierarchy of society.
Yeah, I'd just add that globalization and opening up your economy are difficult things to do. I mean, we know from economic first principles that there's an overall increase in welfare. You know, in total, people are better off with more trade. But that doesn't mean that there won't be some losers. And those losers, often the costs of them are concentrated amongst a relatively small number of people who are relatively good at organising themselves, whereas the benefits are spread more thinly but across the whole of the population. So what you tend to find is that there are lobby groups that argue very strongly against increased openness. For example, certain incumbent businesses that have done very well nicely, very well, thank you, as a result of being effectively a local monopoly and not being exposed to foreign competition. And there may well be, you know, workers in certain sectors that become uncompetitive if you have the possibility of importing cheaper or better goods from overseas. So you need to find some way of managing the complaints from a minority. And I think that's where government action is helpful in terms of making sure that those people aren't left behind, and that can be done in a number of ways. It can be done through the tax and benefit system to redistribute income towards them. It can be done through the education system to train them up for better opportunities. But those sort of short-term adjustment costs shouldn't blind you to the longer-term benefits of having a more open economy. And sort of literally hundreds of years of economic theory and numerous historical examples can show you how much better off an economy is when it opens up. Arguably, China, of course, has stolen a march and is 10, 20 years ahead. But India has lots of long-term advantages, plenty more scope for catch-up gain, better demographics and so on, potential for a better financial system, and many other advantages that I think India can do what China has done without making some of its mistakes along the way.
So, any more questions to the audience? So, should we take a smattering? And could you also direct your question to one or two of the panelists? So, this gentleman here, then that gentleman, and can I take one more? And this gentleman here. So, those three, please.
Yeah, thank you. William Crawley. My question is to both the panelists. And it's really about the Chinese Belt and Road. Do you think that one of the more bizarre meetings I've heard in London is a Pakistani lobbyist urging British investment in the Chinese Belt and Road? Now, there's a lot of local concern about the benefits of the Chinese Belt and Road. And we've seen even economically weak Burma putting a hold on this big dam project, which is part of it. But because the benefits are seen largely as Chinese, and the impact on the countries where these developments are placed is minimal. But my question is, would India ever be persuaded to invest in a Chinese Belt and Road initiative, or would Britain?
Well, in principle, I don't see why not. I mean, there are lots of things that we don't like about China, and traditionally it's used aid and development in Africa, for example, as a political tool, in particular to gain access to cheap commodities. So that maybe can be seen as a counterexample to my general assumption that globalization is a good thing, because the Chinese in particular seem very good at making sure that all the benefits go to them rather than to the locals. But it's a fact of life that China is already the world's second biggest economy. It's got a massive current account surplus. It's a huge potential investor in the rest of the world. So we have to find ways of dealing with them. I personally think the more that we can integrate with them economically and financially, the better, because, as I say, that economy isn't going anywhere other than up. And I would hope that if our economic interests are aligned, then in the long run our political interests will be as well. So although I'm sort of aware of some of the caveats of dealing with China, I'd rather be dealing with China than not dealing with China, if I can put it like that.
Should we take that group of three? I'm sorry, I did change things around. I changed it around, but this gentleman, the white blazer, after this gentleman who has the microphone, and then the gentleman at the back. And then, like I said, we'll use this last 10 minutes for you three. So, sir.
Saeed Yasser Abbas from Vision TV. First of all, I would like to thank you to give me the opportunity to ask this question. I've been listening to a lot of different panelists, and the question I would like to ask is a summary of pretty much everything which I've heard so far. What I've heard that India is rising and the economy is flourishing, and we are talking here that there's very good opportunity for business community of UK to actually do partnership in India. What I've noticed here is one thing that Indian posturing, which seemed quite demanding in a sense that what Britain can bring to India and what they can provide as if they do not need any help and Britain needs them more than they require us. It's a very good time for India that in the light of Brexit, Indians of business community and governments of course see an opportunity to come here and sort of negotiate better deals for the country, which is fair enough. The question I would like to ask here is that any relationship between the two countries, if it is purely about business, I don't think it can be long-lasting unless it's a person-to-person relation, and which is a very valid point raised by one of the panelists that the visa policy which Britain needs to look at and how how we can sort of integrate more than sort of just talking on business terms. But in the lights of current situation of India internally, where we have a lot of problems with their minorities, and the general public, which voted for this government, is very aggressive towards the minorities and the rest of the world. And that posturing I have seen in some of the demands which was made by some of the panelists. Do you think Britain can have a long-lasting relationship with a country where internally a lot of things needs to be improved first?
Okay, good question. Sir with the white blazer.
I think my question is essentially to do with a relationship of India and Pakistan and how this is going to be impacting on what we're talking about. Why is India, and this question is to Duncan, why is India averse to having a third country facilitating a dialogue between the two countries? Or why is peace so elusive to India because it doesn't want to talk about things?
This is Taimur Iqbal from Prime TV. It's not exactly a very relevant question, but this is particularly in reference to the Chinese investment in Hambantota port. The deal which turned out to be a very, very dangerous deal for the Sri Lankan government. President Rajapaksa, former president, had allegedly taken a $7.6 million bribery on that. And now the deal had finally collapsed. The Sri Lankan government, not being able to make payments on their debts, were forced to give Chinese that 1,500 or 15,000 acre of land, and now China effectively has that entire area in their grasp. Interestingly, the port itself is not exactly your port. It has only been able to draw something like 45 to 50 ships since 2012. So the allegation or the accusation is it might be used for military purpose. The China string of pearl policy. Now, in that context, let's come to the one belt, one road in Pakistan. It's a very gray area for us Pakistani. We've still not been able to get a clear light. Yes, we are given a big picture, massive picture on what's going to happen in Pakistan, a lot of progress, a lot of good economic opportunity, business. And yet there is a certain gray area because the stakeholders from both sides are not completely opening up. So what's your understanding of one belt, one road in Pakistani context, in regards to Chinese intention and having a history of what they've done in Sri Lanka?
It's fascinating. So we basically have a Pakistan question, a Belt and Road question, and if I can understand your question, again, it's kind of how can the UK really invest in India despite discrepancies, it seems. So, gentlemen.
So I'll take the first one, the discrepancies question, if I want a better way of putting it. Well, I'm increasingly coming to the view that there are two great things that can unite countries. One is football. I mean, I don't know if you've been following the Football World Cup, but it's been absolutely brilliant. I mean, to see the supporters and players of each country coming together. I don't know if you saw the pictures of how the Japanese players had cleaned their changing room after being knocked out by Belgium and left a thank you note in Russian to the hosts afterwards. So sport is one thing, but I also believe the other thing is trade. And there are unfortunately some major barriers to overcome here. I mean, one is the assumption, which is particularly keenly felt in the White House, that trade is a zero-sum game. That unless you're running a trade surplus with somebody, then you're losing. Which, to my mind, is actually the wrong way round. I mean, I actually think importing in a way is better than exporting, because exporting means that somebody else is consuming something. Importing means that I'm consuming something. So arguably, I'd be quite happy to run a trade deficit, provided somebody else is willing to finance it in some way. So I think